Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I am happy to welcome you to today's CUGC Connect webinar with Nutanix. Going to have an hour packed with updates, 2019 updates for everything Citrix and Nutanix. So I'm excited to get into this today. But before we do, want to introduce who's on our call with us. We have, as our moderator today, we have Mike Nelson. Mike is a member of the CUGC Content Working Group, which is a group that meets pretty regularly to come up with content ideas and help manage all the content for CUGC online, which includes webinars like this and blogs and everything in between. Mike, would you like to say hello?
Hi, greetings everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Mike. Mike is going to keep an eye on all the questions for us today. So as you have those, we'd like you to type those into the Q&A, or it's just called the question box for you, sorry, or maybe called the chat panel. But whatever you have, I know GoToWebinar has been changing the displays. Type your questions in as you have them. Jarian has a lot of content for us today, so I think what he's going to do is try to get through the presentation and hold all the questions for the end unless there's something particularly burning. But do type them in as you have them so you don't forget, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jarian Gibson. He is a Senior Solutions Architect with Nutanix. But in addition to that role, he is also a Kansas City CUGC leader and a CTP. And you can find him, here's his Twitter address, Jarian Gibson. So Jarian, are you ready to get us going?
Yep, ready to go.
All right, I'm gonna send the screen over to you right now. There you go.
Okay, so you see my PowerPoint screen here?
Yes, see an agenda slide.
Okay, so thank you, Stephanie, for having me on today. Thank you, Mike, for being the moderator and being on with me. So, here's the agenda today. We're going to talk about Citrix on Nutanix 2019 updates. We'll do an introduction, which we kind of already done. We'll do Nutanix Overview. Some of you on the call may be new to Nutanix, but for those of you that run Nutanix today, there are some updates in part of the overview, so listen for that. We'll talk about Windows and Office, mainly impact of different versions, security patches, and so forth, and how that impacts density and performance. We'll talk about image management on Nutanix. We'll talk about image migration. We'll talk about disaster recovery. I'll put some links up for additional resources, and then we'll take questions at the end. So Stephanie introduced me. Main thing is that I just joined Nutanix about a year ago. I work on performance solutions in engineering, focused on EUC. And so the main role that I do is things like testing our plugins, giving feedback, helping with enhancements, doing our reference architecture guides that you guys see. So anything Citrix on Nutanix across the different hypervisors, that's our team. Performance testing, and just new functionality testing and feedback. So that's the role I'm in at Nutanix. So Nutanix Overview, again, some of you may already have Nutanix, but for those of you that are new to Nutanix, I'll just do a quick overview. So what Nutanix is our architecture is a foundation for enterprise clouds, taking everything from the management of it, the automation, orchestration, virtualization, the storage, the data, the servers, and converging that into a single appliance to run your apps on. From a Citrix standpoint, this is basically EUC in a box, as we call it, and being able to basically add more nodes like building blocks as you scale up and increase your infrastructure. We have flexible scale out architecture. So as you go from starting off with 3 nodes for EUC for Citrix and then expanding out to more nodes, basically you're going to have the storage and the compute all on the same nodes with the VMs, our controllers, our software, and then scale out from there, making sure that as you scale out, you'll have the same performance you had as day one as you get to the next year, as you increase your infrastructure, increase your user load, and so forth. And also too is that with our data local is that all the performance is local on the actual node you're on, not across the network, not pulling from remote storage. It's all local, giving you the best performance possible. And then two, as you start doing lifecycle operations for hardware, you can run mixed nodes, hardware generations by default. So as you start turning down old hardware, you can add new hardware to the same cluster and be able to get the same features and functionality as you had from day one with original hardware as you do with new hardware when you add that. You know, a lot of times people see this as a marketing slide, but this is what my team actually does. So when you see about our scaling, especially when you run Citrix on Nutanix, is that we have predictable performance and scalability, meaning that when we have that 2U block with 4 nodes in it and say we have 400 users on that block, as we had a second block, we're going 800 users, a third block 1200, a fourth block 1600. That way you're seeing that as you start with, you know, one set of requirements here on day one, and as you expand your environment, that performance it shouldn't change over time. And that's some of the testing that we do in our environment, whether it's using XenApp or XenDesktop on our infrastructure. The other thing too is that again about scale. So we should see the same performance, same response time, same user experience as we start off with that small first install of 300 users, and then scaling that to several hundred to several thousand users as well. We should be seeing that same response time, that same performance, and not see any performance go down as we start adding on to our environment like Lego building blocks. We do have native support. So for those of you new on the call, we do have native support for our hypervisor, Nutanix AHV. By default, if you're running Citrix Cloud or the on-prem virtual apps and desktops, formerly known as XenDesktop, you won't see it by default in the dropdown for the hypervisor connection. Make sure you install that plugin across all the delivery controllers in that zone. Also, the same thing in that resource location to be able to talk that. We actually have a third-party plugin that we have to install for us that we take advantage of the Citrix provisioning SDK. For those of you that are Nutanix customers, make sure that you are updating this plugin as we release new versions. A good example is that sometimes APIs change and we have to tweak things and provide updates and also provide newer functionality and so forth. One recent example is when 1903 came out, we noticed an issue with some of our cloud customers about some slow power actions. We worked with Citrix, got this fixed, updated the plugin, and so that's a good example of always making sure that you're updating the plugin because we are fixing things, we are improving things, and things are changing too on the API interface side as well. The other thing too is that within the, you have a question, Mike?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Pretty relevant question that came up on the screen is going back to the team slide, the cluster slide that you first talked about. Mm-hmm. Actually, a couple folks have chimed in, and I think we should address this, is that Joshua is saying, doesn't the Nutanix reference architecture show smaller cluster sizes versus large clusters, number one? But then we also have, I believe it's Evo. I don't want to butcher your names here, but it says your picture shows starting with one node, and unless I'm mistaken, that is not a viable configuration. And I know you can explain this, but I just want to make sure we cover this while it's still fresh in your mind here about that slide.
Yeah, good question. So actually, you can start with one node, but for EUC, we don't recommend that. We actually want you to start with 3 nodes and scale from there. So good question on that one. And as far as for the one about the reference architecture and smaller cluster size versus large clusters, that is more of a design decision. We do have some customers running large clusters. You know, I'm more of liking smaller customers and looking at different failure domains and so forth, but that's definitely a design decision, and that's some things that we talk about with our teams when architecting with customers. And then another one is for the MCS IO. We do not support the MCS IO. You won't even see that in our plugin. The thing is, with our infrastructure, we don't need the RAM caching for that IO because of where we're doing things with the software and the performance between our SSDs and our spinning disk. Our flash to our spinning disk is that we don't need the IO from the RAM caching, so you won't see that option in our plugin. Usually for the MCS IO, that's more for installs that may need that extra IO, where on Nutanix infrastructure, and you'll see this in our RAs, we don't suffer from that problem, so we don't even have that option for RAM in our plugin. And that's more some of the plugins that I was looking through real quick.
Yeah.
We also do support PVS as well, and I'll talk about this here with our plugins. So we do have plugins for both MCS and PVS. In the past, they were separate plugins. Also for the Citrix Cloud Connector plugin, that was separate as well. Within the last few versions, we actually did a combined installer. So you have one installer to download, which you have the option for the MCS AHV plugin, and that's going to be for the on-prem install. You'll have the Cloud Connector plugin, and that's going to be for if you're using the Virtual Apps and Desktops cloud service. And then you'll have the PVS plugin if you're using PVS in the environment. One thing to note, the main difference between the plugin for on-prem versus the Cloud Connector is it's just looking for additional services for whether it's a delivery controller or not. But from the rest of it, all the functionality, everything else under the hood is the same. It's just looking for additional services. But we do support both provisioning services and machine creation services. So to answer that question.
The other one here is, the other one I see here is a plugin supported with AOS 10.5.4. This is obviously a specific use case. It doesn't seem to work after the upgrade we performed recently.
Yeah, that's one. Let me get your info. We take that offline about the 10.5.4 issue. And then as far as what type of cache that we support with provisioning, we support the RAM cache with failover and also the direct write cache to the disk. Again, the same thing with the MCS IO on our platform. We don't suffer from any kind of the performance degradation, so we don't typically need the RAM caching piece. So typically we use the RAM cache to disk, or we use the RAM cache with overflow to get the fix that implements and set the RAM cache to 0 for that as well. But again, we don't need the extra IO from the RAM because we have all that built into our infrastructure.
Yeah, and we're going to hit two more questions here, and then we're going to move on because these questions are coming fast and furious here. And Jarian's got a lot of stuff to get through. So the first thing is there an easy way to get notified when a new version of the plugin on the portal? Is there some kind of mechanism that you guys are thinking about implementing for that?
I believe on our site, and I'll have to double check this to see if you can get alerts from the site. That's one thing I can take and send out with the follow-up from this call about that. So I'll take that one as well.
Okay,
that's a good question.
And the last one is this is a debatable, answer. I could even debate this with you, but choosing between MCS and PVS, any recommendations from Nutanix?
I'll touch on that later.
Side of things. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll touch on that and when I get into image management.
Okay. Good.
Okay. And then one more question I see here is, will the plugin ever be added into the Cloud Connector? So the way we do our plugin is through the provisioning SDK. So we maintain that outside of the actual releases of the Citrix releases. There's been some, there's two ways you can look at that, right? Anytime there's an issue or an enhancement needs to be done, if it's done outside of Citrix, we control that release cadence and how that's released and how often that can be updated. If we roll that into Citrix, like the other hypervisors, then we're under their release cadence. So getting a fix may not be as fast or as quick as controlling our own release cycle. Right. One thing that we could do, though, possibly is in the dropdown, possibly have some kind of pointer to say, look, here's AHV, or have some kind of indication in the workflow about other hypervisors that use the SDK framework that we use, saying you have to install this plugin to get full functionality type of thing. But for me, I like having the separate release cadence because we control when we can add features and when that gets fixed, and we can do it faster without having to wait for the different release cadences of Citrix. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I and you're not the only vendor to fall into that, that situation because of the differences in between Citrix releases and your releases and so on and so forth. But also, one last question here before we move on is, what if a new plugin fails? Does it allow to revert back to an old config?
Yes, so you can uninstall and reinstall the older plugin and still use that. It's not going to delete your connection. It's not going to turn things off, but you definitely want to do that inside of a maintenance window just to be on the safe side.
Okay, we're going to move on here. I know there are a lot of questions, and there's no way physically that I would be able to answer the questions in the answer box here from Jarian, because he just, you know, he's a wealth of information, and I can't transcribe that fast. So hopefully you'll be able to review the recording on any of the answers that, you know, we may have gone through pretty quickly. But I'm going to let Jarian go here because he's got a lot to cover.
All right, so going to the next slide here. And so we also have Cloud Connect for Citrix. So you can deploy the Cloud Connector VMs, do a one-click deployment, get those set up for AHV, get your API credentials from Citrix Cloud, and do the Cloud Connect plugin for that. And then also too, we have a Director plugin. So if you are using Director for your monitoring solution, which, you know, it's free for with included with virtual apps and desktops, you should be using this. The main thing to note is that it's at the machine level, and it shows the storage performance on the VM. The main thing to note here is that there was, so we use an API framework for this for Director, and other vendors use it as well. The main thing here is that if you're on 7.17 or above, make sure you're using the latest plugin, because there were some API changes and we had to update our plugin for that. And so if you're having problems where you're just not seeing the information, one, check your plugin version, and then two, make sure the communication you know, between the controller and the plugin and Director are all performing fine as well. The next thing here is we do have GPU support. We had this for a while. The main thing that we've added here for GPU is vGPU under NVIDIA. In our 5.10 release, we added support for the P4, for the T4 16 gig, and the V100 32 gig. In early releases, we support like the M10, the P40, the V100 16 gig. And so just know that depending on what hardware you have is going to support how many GPUs you can have in a host. One question we keep getting asked, you know, at Synergy in our booth and even with customers, is when are we going to support vGPU live migration? And all I can say is stay tuned, that's being worked on. So hopefully we'll see that sooner than later. Nutanix files. This is what I like to talk about, is because you can have the same file server infrastructure VMs as we do with our architecture. So we have scale out VMs for file servers, and they can run on the same infrastructure as your actual workload VMs. So think of keeping things like your NAS storage, your redirected folders, profiles. If you're using profile management, provisioning services, your Vdi store, for example, share file and app layering, the Elm share, the user layers, the Elastic layers, keeping those on the same cluster and the same management as your VM cluster and your VM workloads. So same single pane of glass for that. You know, if you have the extra resources for it, you can maximize that by having the same file servers on those same clusters. So no external storage needed, all the same benefits that we have in our management for it, and so forth. And the nice thing too is that here recently, every customer has 1 terabyte of free storage per cluster. So if you have a cluster, no matter what the size of it, every cluster gets 1 terabyte of free files. So one of the first and good use cases that we have customers doing with this is using this for the provisioning services of Vdi store. And I'll talk about, you know, some benefits of that later on when we get to image management. But files is a good solution for these different use cases, and we have customers using this for the use cases here on the right in the blue. Vdi Core Licensing is something we announced recently. And so instead of having our capacity-based licensing that we had, we now have a VDI licensing option. Basically, it's like a per user per VM option. And so instead of paying you know, per node for the software and so forth, basically what you license it is by the users and the VMs. And then so if you have like a 10 node cluster versus a 5 node cluster, the license cost is the same because it's by the per user per VM, not by the actual number of nodes in the capacity base as in the past. This is going to be specifically for the EUC workloads, so virtual apps and desktops. And then you can have the option of getting the AOS Pro or Ultimate features, run our hypervisor, and look at other ways. The nice thing too, if you're doing DR, you can also do this you don't have to license DR separately. DR will fall under this as a licensing cost, and also you can run the infrastructure VMs for virtual apps and desktops on the cluster as well. Looking at, what's that?
Joe, Jarian, I gotta interrupt again. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Kind of a question that deserves some kind of debate, if you will, or however you want to put it, but why AHV rather than ESXi? Is there a cost savings, or what are the points of using AHV over ESXi?
So one, it's included when you buy Nutanix. So when you buy Nutanix, no matter what level you get, whether it's starter, whether it's pro, whether it's ultimate, you get AHV included. So right there, it comes to a cost savings. And then two, it looks like there's some things that we're seeing with performance as well that I'll talk about, where through our testing and through some of our updates, we've actually shown some performance gains as well of using AHV for Windows workloads also. But a big thing is cost. A big thing is also too is management. So within our management, there's no vCenter, for example. So when you build a cluster, you have one cluster, you have a floating IP for that cluster. And what happens is you point everything to that cluster. So if one node goes down, that moves over to another node in the cluster. So there's no single point of failure of management. It's basically scale out management. And so you don't throw out vCenter. The operations as far as doing the patches and updates with our lifecycle management. So there's some operational and there's also some cost savings there when doing AHV versus ESXi. I see the one about BDM. Yes, we support BDM with our plugin. By default, it wants to use Pixie, but if your template is using BDM, it will do BDM, and if BDM fails, it will fill back to Pixie. So yes, we do support BDM to answer that question. Any other ones I missed, Mike?
Yeah, the last one just came in. Can we manage disaster recovery in Nutanix? I think you actually have a section on that coming up.
Yes.
Yep.
So I'll talk about DR, I'll talk about image management. Let me keep going through, and then if I haven't answered at the end, we'll go through and answer our questions. But as far as for Citrix on Nutanix, these are the things that we can do. So for Nutanix components, we have our Nutanix core. Our AHV is our hypervisor, our AOS is our software, Prism is our management, and then Essentials, we have things like Calm. So Calm is an extra piece you can purchase, which does automation, orchestration, scale up, scale down, tear things down as well. For that, we have Files, which I talked about, and I'll touch on a little bit more on Files. And then we have Flow, which is our microsegmentation network security piece for securing the communication between VMs and categorizing them, etc. And I'll actually have a link later on about reference architecture for using Flow with Citrix at the end. And then we talked about DR. So in 5.10, we announced Xi Leap and Leap. And that's going to be our DR orchestration and some things that you can do for DR. So I actually have a section on that I'll talk about. As far as integrations, we have the plugins for Citrix, so MCS, PVS, power management. So if you're using full clone persistent desktops, we have power management. We have the plugin for Citrix Cloud, which will do the same thing as our MCS plugin and power management, the director plugin I talked about. And then we support the virtual appliances. So we support the NetScaler VPX, which is now known as the application delivery controller. We support that run on Nutanix AHV. We support NMAS, which is now known as ADM. That just got certified on Nutanix. We support SD-WAN. We support app layering as well for the virtual appliance for that. And then extra tools we can use, migration. We have a Move product I'll talk about. So if you're moving from one hypervisor to another, you can use our Move product. And then also too, if you not see Nutanix and you want to test Nutanix, we have a thing called Nutanix CE, to where you can actually download it on commodity hardware, run it in non-production environments, so lab testing, proof of concept type stuff, and use our plugins. You can install our plugins on it, you can download it with it. It runs AHV only. You can install files on it. You can use the plugins. You can install NetScaler VPX. You can get an experience like production would be, but it's not going to be the same as full production. It's going to give you more of the user experience, how it would be, and give you some ways to test it as well. So that's what CE does, and I'll have links for that going forward. So that's kind of the intro here about overview. So some updates for those of you that are customers, and some intro for those of you that are new to Nutanix. The next section I'll talk about here is Windows and Office. So again, I'm in Solutions, Performance, and Engineering team, and I'm focused on EUC. And so me and my counterpart, this is what we do, is we do testing the different Windows versions, Office versions, security patches, when we make changes to our hypervisor through updates and so forth, and we test that impact, and we see how that's going to impact our customers, and we update our reference architectures and tech notes based on that. So first thing is optimizations, right? This is not specific to Nutanix, but you want to optimize your image, whether it's Windows 10, whether it's Windows Server 2016, 2019, whatever. You want to make sure that you optimize your image, because that's like giving away free performance and free density if you're not doing that. So look at disabling items, turning off unused services, Windows updates, Windows Defender or any AV. Make sure that you're properly setting that for non-persistent images and so forth, and how you want to handle scans. Look at your scheduled tasks, any optimizations that run, schedule scans, memory diagnostics, and then look at GPU hardware acceleration. If you're not using GPUs, make sure you turn that off in IE, Office, other apps, etc. Otherwise, you're wasting extra performance by having that turned on when not using that. And then look at removing items, things like the Windows Store apps, in Windows 10 that you don't need to have. The OneDrive per user install, if you're not using that, make sure you get rid of that, because that will sit there and run when people log in, causing logon times and performance impact. And then look at changing things like your power plan, optimize your first logon, make sure it's not doing those first setup items, get rid of those things, optimize that profile, look at your local policies, look at registry settings, and if you have to use OneDrive, go through and do the OneDrive per machine install instead of the per user install that Microsoft recently released. There are optimization tools out there. There's a guide from Citrix for that. There's a guide from VMware. Citrix has their optimization tool, the Optimizer, which is a really good tool. Martin Zugic has done a great job with that, and he's also going through and enhancing that and adding more features and functionality to it. If VMware has their tool, the main thing with VMware is don't sit there and use the logon VSI template. That's more for hero numbers, but that's not going to give a good user experience. You don't want to use that in production with your users. There's the desktop virtualization BPA that myself and Case Baggerman have been involved with. You can use, and then Microsoft has finally released their guidance too for Windows 10 1803 out there on their site. One of the main things though with optimizations though is you kind of got to balance user experience with performance and density. You want to turn things off you're not using, but you don't want to turn things off that could cause a user experience issue. So make sure you want to go through and test those optimizations to make sure they're not going to cause a user impact experience in your environment. Who has seen this right here on the VDA install? So the optimized performance, which basically launches the old target OS optimizer that you see in PVS. You want to make sure you check this because there's some optimizations here when it does this, but you don't want to do this alone because you're not fully optimized. If you don't run this during the VDA install, there's actually it's in program files under Citrix. You can run it off after that as well. So if you didn't check it, you can go back and still run it. But one thing here is in our testing that we've done, you're not fully optimized just running that alone. So you're missing about 40% of optimizations if you don't run this along with an optimization tool like the Citrix Optimizer. So again, make sure you're optimizing things because you're actually giving away performance when you're not running these both because of that, because you're not fully optimized. One thing that we do, so when our testing is when we do any kind of security patch, impact, OS versions, hypervisor versions, Office versions, we use logon VSI. That's the industry standard. So we run several runs of this and then take the average of those runs. We just don't run it once and then take the numbers. We actually run this multiple times. And the nice thing with this is that we're able to predict changes, find performance problems. I'll share with you a story that we had internally with some performance that we saw in the field where we helped fix an issue because of that. When you're running logon VSI, there are two important metrics. One is called the VSI max, and that's your density, so higher is better. And then one is called the VSI base, and that's application response time, so lower is better. So you could be having high density, but if your application response times are low, that's going to cause a user experience issue. So you want to kind of find a sweet spot between those two. So some of the things that we test again is Windows 10 versions, Windows Server 2016 versus 2019, Office changes, and then security patches like Spectre Meltdown and the L1TF mitigations. So when you look at Windows 10, so we're looking at the release of Windows 10 and how often they're coming out, and with these new releases, potentially come new problems, new performance impact, new things we have to optimize for. So we're constantly testing different runs of these as Microsoft releases these. The main thing here is that, anytime you introduce a change into your environment, you always want to test that first, get a baseline, and then kind of determine how that's going to impact your environment, your user experience, your density, and so forth with these Windows 10 releases. So one thing we're going to show here is impact on user density. So in our testing here, from going from 1709 to 1803 to 1809 to 1903, this is what we kind of saw in our VSI max. So notice here that 1709, we're at there. We got a little bit higher performance in 1803. It dropped pretty big at 1909, but then we're seeing better numbers versus all three in 1903. So this is the testing that we do internally. Again, this is the VSI max, so higher is better. Now, how does application response times look? And this is the VSI base, so lower is better. So 1709, 1803, roughly the same. 1809, we saw a jump in application response time, so user experience went down. And then 1903, that came back down. So these are things we're talking about as we go through and test the different versions to make sure as we're publishing our RAs that it doesn't impact user experience and density. Another thing too is that I talked about why testing, why we do different runs of the operating systems, what's going on, is because with different operating system changes, new things can happen. So we had a customer use case where they went to 1803, they're like an early adopter of it, and they saw density drop on their cluster. They saw performance issues on their cluster. And so we looked at it as like, okay, the VM CPUs look fine, but the overall cluster host performance was terrible. So, in our internal team, in my counterpart Sven, in our internal AHV team, we did a lot of testing on this to find this issue. Well, working with Microsoft, we found out that in 1803, Microsoft added Hyper-V enlightenments to the operating system. And what that does is basically, instead of taking a VM and putting it in, or sorry, taking an OS and putting it in a VM, so basically it's the same as physical, it's not aware it's a VM. Well, as of 1803, it's aware that's a VM, so they put these Hyper-V enlightenments in, and what the problem was is that there was a sync timer talking back and forth, which we didn't have implemented in AHV. Once we got that implemented, we actually fixed that performance, and we actually started seeing better numbers than other hypervisors based on that performance because we implemented that fix. Now, if you are a Nutanix customer and you're running 1803 or higher, make sure you're on one of these versions of the LTS or STS releases to get that fixed if you're going to be on 1803, because that's going to give you some performance back there because of that. And again, this all started from a customer issue that we went through testing using our tools, and we're able to find this issue and get that fixed and rolled out to our customers. So security patches, so Spectrum Meltdown, Foreshadow, the L1TF, all those are software mitigations today. Hopefully Cascade Lake, that's coming out, that's just out now, will fix this in hardware, but right now this is what we're seeing with software mitigations for that. So, just look here about the default settings. Windows 10, disable hypothreading, both enabled. Server 2016 or earlier, they're not there. Disable hypothreading. And then Server 2019, you'll see that Meltdown's there. Disable hypothreading. And then on ESX, that's the side channel aware scheduler. So that's what they look like from those default settings for those security issues. So when we looked at testing this, we saw what happens here with our log on VSI max. So when we don't have any mitigations enabled, so they're all disabled right now, we're at okay performance. When we do the Spectrum Meltdown protection, we drop about 7%, and then we do the L1TF, we drop about just over 30%. The reason why with that is because, again, with L1TF, the foreshadow stuff, we are basically turning off hyperthreading, so we're using all real cores in that scenario. Again, this is a VSI max, so higher is better. When we look at the VSI base, which is the application response time, you see about a 12% jump in application response times, and then you see it go back down a little bit with the L1TF. And the reason being there is that with the L1TF, since hyperthreading is disabled, we're using real cores instead of hyperthreaded cores, so that's where we're seeing some of that back there because of that. But again, density is not going to be the same as we saw in our VSI max numbers. So a couple of things here. We tested this versus other hypervisors too. We saw some better performance. If you have seen any of our .next sessions with myself, Case, Sven, and Brian, we actually go through the comparisons of those. And we've actually saw better performance versus other hypervisors in our testing. But so a Windows 10 summary here is make sure you're optimizing your images, because that's going to give you basically free performance, and increase your density. Benchmark your changes. I can't stress this enough. Find some kind of way to baseline your images. It doesn't have to be log on VSI. Just make sure that you're just testing them as you're making changes to your environment, benchmarking those, getting a baseline so you know what the impact will be to your environment. And then if you're doing 1803 or higher, if you're on Nutanix, AHV is a great hypervisor. We see some performance improvements with it, so run Windows 10 on AHV. Office 2016 compared to 2019. So look at the VSI max here and the VSI base. So VSI max, again, higher is better. And this is 1709 of 2016 compared to 2019 on the same operating system. So you see about 8% drop in performance, and then about a 2% increase in user response times, or I'm sorry, application response times. So you're seeing a little different impact there between just changing your Office version. Now think if you change your Office version plus your operating system, what kind of impact that will have. Then if we look at Windows Server versus Windows Server 2016 versus Windows Server 2019, you see that we have about 18% difference in our density there with the VSI Max score. And then we look at the actual VSI base, we see that the application response time has gone way up there versus the different change there. And then we look at the CPU utilization. So about a 9% increase in CPU utilization between 2016 and 2019. And then we look at login time stayed the same, but as we get newer updates, more optimization info, and so forth for 2019, we'll continually test and update these numbers as well to see if that impact comes back down or if it goes up or stays the same. Then we look at Office. So if we take Office 2016, and I know it's not supported on 2019, but if we just compare the same version of Office on 2016 versus 2019, you see, for the most part, about a 7% difference in performance, except for PowerPoint stays about the same. So again, there's your impact of security patches, Office, and operating system versions as well. Any questions real quick, Mike? I'm kind of speeding through because we only have 20 minutes left, so.
Yeah, sorry. We have quite a few questions actually, and I'm not sure which ones you want to tackle. But you're talking about one of the ones I saw here was person was talking about Esxi frame. Okay, so they'd like to hear more about the Esxi frame acquisition, if you have any information on that.
So we're talking about Citrix on here, so I'm not going to talk about Xi frame.
Okay.
I'll talk mainly about Citrix on here, so sorry, I'm not going to address that.
Okay.
And then let me see.
You have a thing about first login optimization. Please elaborate.
Yeah, so things like when you first do a profile, I'm going blank here on what it's called, but when everything runs, the first run things that always run for like applications, the startup items, making sure that you're clearing those out. I'm going blank here on the name right now. I'll come back to that. I'm just going blank on what they're called in my head. But you go through and basically those things that run when you first log in, that's the profile up. Those things can be cleared out in an environment to make sure that the first time run optimization is better instead of having to run for each user. One of the main things was the OneDrive per user install, but the other things too in Windows that will run each time a new user logs in. You want to get rid of those, and that's what I'm talking about.
That's the OOB, right? The
yes.
out-of-box experience, yeah.
Yes, that. Thank you.
Yep. Everything else, I think we can hold off a little bit. One other thing was, do you lose anything housing Citrix files on a management cluster as opposed to the VM cluster? And as he's saying, sorry, Nutanix files, not Citrix files. So he's actually talking about Nutanix files. So
if you're doing like a dedicated Nutanix files cluster versus on the same cluster, the main thing is just coming across the network there. With the be on the same cluster, it's going to be accessed there locally from the same environment, so it's not having to go out and come back in. So that's the main difference there between a separate cluster versus on the cluster. And also, it's another cluster to manage too as well. That's the main difference there.
Cool. All right, keep going.
All right. Image management. So we'll talk about image management on Nutanix. So for those of you that are new to Nutanix, we support every hypervisor that is supported for virtual apps and desktops. So you have your choice of Zen Server, which is now Citrix Hypervisor, Hyper-V, AHV, ESX. Majority of our Nutanix customers, they're either running AHV is the majority one, and then we have other ones running ESX as well. Those are our two main ones that we see out there. But as far as the broker, since we support Citrix Cloud and on-prem, same thing, same for hypervisors. And then as far as the actual provisioning, we support, full clones, persistent desktops, provisioning services, and machine creation services for both for the cloud service and for the on-prem piece as well. Now, we talked about MCS or PVS, right? And so this is more of a discussion here real quick. So we support both. We have customers that run both and happy with both. Martin Zuguk in the tech zone out there on Citrix has wrote a nice document on, kind of a decision matrix. I gave some feedback on that because a lot of this on this big one right here, when it comes to PVS, a lot of the time, it's more preference what you want to do. There's really no hard requirement there out of this big main matrix here. So, talking with him, giving feedback, these are kind of your 4 main things here if you're going to do PVS or MCS, and that's going to be whether it's Nutanix, non-Nutanix, or whatever. The biggest thing here is it physical machines, then it's definitely PVS, right? MCS, you can't do physical. If it's cloud deployment, you have to do MCS. Yes, VMware on VMC on AWS supports it. I'll talk about some stuff what we can do in our cloud service, but for the general part, for AWS, GCP, Azure, you can't do PVS in the cloud. Those are probably the 2 main hard requirements. I wouldn't really do persistent desktops with PVS, although you can persist the cache, but they're kind of going away from that persistent cache. And then license entitlements. You get MCS with every version of Zen Apps and Desktop, or PVS, you get to be in certain editions for it. I'm sorry, virtual apps and desktops. So that's where it comes down to, is kind of these 4 main things. Again, we support both. We have customers that run both. The main thing I want to talk though is that with MCS though, we kind of, with our technology, we make MCS shine Nutanix basically, and I'll tell you why right here. So right now we have MCS here with local storage. The main thing here is that with MCS and local storage, yes, you'll have local performance, everything's reading and writing to local performance, but because it's local performance, local storage that's distributed and not looking like it's shared, is that you have to have a storage location for every node with local storage in here, and that master image has to be copied across every location. Just like if you were on regular 3-tier and you had multiple storage repositories or data stores, that master image gets copied to every storage location that's defined in Studio, and that's the downfall there of local storage. When you're doing unoptimized distributed storage, so yes, it's distributed storage, it's still local, but it looks like it's shared storage to the hypervisor. The main thing here is it's kind of a spray and pray type thing here, is that we'll have we'll have our machines out there everywhere, and that master disk will be pinned to one node. And with MCS, it's going to go back across the network and always copy from that, always read from that, and then you're going to cause a hotspot on that local storage, and you're also going to have all that extra network traffic across that local storage. With Nutanix, and this is why you see a lot of customers running MCS on our infrastructure, is because we make MCS shine. So we take the best of local, we take the best of distributed, and basically we use a functionality or technology called shadow clones. And what happens is that every node, even though it's shared, every node in the background will get a copy of that master disk locally. So all the reads and writes are always happening locally. So you're getting the benefit of data locality, but also shared storage as well. And that's where shadow clones comes in, and we make MCS shine. Now, when we get to things like multiple locations and images and that kind of stuff, I'll talk about that as well. But a lot of our customers choose to run MCS and Nutanix because we cover a lot of the downfalls of MCS architecture with our shadow clones technology and our distributed storage. So that's why you'll see a lot of people, believe with MCS on Nutanix, but again, we support both. We have customers that run both. It's just that we make MCS shine. So image management using Nutanix. So if you're using machine creation services, the main thing here is that you have to move that master image around, right? So what you're going to have here is you have 2 clusters, whether it's DR or multiple clusters in the same data center or multiple clusters across locations. With our software, we have protection and replication stuff built in to where we can replicate that image across to the other cluster, the other data centers. And also we're looking for more enhancements to this to improve this process. But we use protection domains. If you're using Prism Elements, if you're in 5.10 and later, we can use runbooks and protection policies for that to get that image moved around between different clusters. Now, if you're doing full clones, same concept, but it's going to be more of a pin scenario to one location or a DR event, because since it's a one-to-one persistent machine, they're not going to be able to roam between data centers and that kind of stuff. But same technology is that we can basically use our protection domains, use our runbooks, and protect those and get those copied over and brought up in a DR scenario. And I'll address DR here in a minute. I'm just trying to get through some of this content real quick. Now we talk about provisioning services. A lot of people choose to use local stores, which is fine because all the disks are local to the PVS server. Now with SMB 3.x and all the new features of the operating systems, people are starting to use file storage for this instead of having to maintain that copy across clusters. there's no built replication in PVS. You can use the Vdisk replicator, you can use scripts, you can use other tools to do it, but there's really no built-in option for it. So you're looking at something to add on for that. And so basically, if you're doing local storage, you're having 8 copies, 7 local and 1 across the wire if you're doing local storage. Now with files, which we have customers doing this, basically we're pointing our PVS Vdisk store to a files instance locally on that cluster. And then what's happening is we have 2 copies, 1 local and 1 across the wire to the other cluster because everything's pointing to that file share. And with our files, we support all the I shouldn't say all of them. We support SMB3 features. We have the performance there for it. Also, you get that 1 terabyte free. So there's no reason not to look at this if you're using PVS on Nutanix as your Vdisk storage location. Also, too, don't forget with PVS is that once you get a few a few target devices loaded, that Vdisk is cached in RAM on the PVS server. So it's not like you're always going back and forth across to that storage once you're booting a couple target devices too as well. And that's with any file share or PVS, just something to know there. Image migration. So like I said, we have a lot of customers that run AHV on Nutanix. And so what happens when you're coming from vSphere or XenServer or Hyper-V and you want to come over to AHV? So we do have some migration tools. So we have a tool called Move. What Move does is basically it's a automation piece for migrating your image over from vSphere or Hyper-V or AWS. Move does not support XenServer. And right now you can't do AHV to AHV, but you don't need to with that because you can just export the image and import it to the image service. But anyways, so if you're migrating from vSphere to Hyper-V, you can use a Move product. And what the Move does is it takes all the manual legwork out of having to migrate your master images, your persistent desktops from vSphere Hyper-V over to AHV. And we support all the OSs that we support for AHV. So, Windows 7 and up basically. With 2019, I believe they are coming soon. I double check that one. So that's Move. So if you want to migrate into AHV from other, vSphere Hyper-V, Move is a good product to use to help you with the automation and take all the manual legwork out of migrating your image. Now, if you're on XenServer, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to clarify that is only V2V then, not P2V. There's no.
Yes. The good thing, Mike. So Move is V2V. So it's Hypervisor. If you want to do physical, you can use tools like disk to VHD. There's a tool from Shoreline you can use. You can also use Shoreline, a third-party product for XenServer as well. But we don't have Move for XenServer. So XenServer is a manual process. Now, the main difference between if you're XenServer from a third party or if you're XenServer on Nutanix is going to be that if it's XenServer on Nutanix, because of our architecture, we lock down being able to add storage repositories that are NFS or iSCSI or Fiber Channel. You can only add the CIFS ISO stores if it's XenServer on Nutanix. But after that, everything else is the same. If it's XenServer on Nutanix, basically you're using the NFS commands directly in the CLI to mount a remote NFS share and doing the copy that way. If it's non-Nutanix XenServer, basically what you do is just whitelist the storage in AHV, and then you mount an NFS storage repository, and then do the copy over that way. There's been a couple of migrations I've been involved in with customers, and if you want to do it faster and do it in less time, what you can do instead of doing it from XenCenter is actually do it from the CLI and run a copy command from each host in the XenServer resource pool. That way you can do parallel migrations over to AHV instead of doing one at a time through the GUI, which can take a little bit longer. And I've helped customers improve their migration time by going through and showing them how to do this through the CLI and doing multiple hosts at a time. Once the image is over to Nutanix, all you have to do is use our image service to import it and then create a VM. And if it's dedicated, have them reconnect to it. If it's MCS, spin up the clones from it. If it's a PVS master image that was reverse image, just re-PVS that over to a target or an image and then deploy that from the PVS tools. The main thing though is that also too is clean up your VM, install VirtIO tools at the start of the process. Once you shut it down, don't power it back on, and then go through the steps here and go through that way. And it's worked very well for people migrating from XenServer to AHV. Migration tips: if you're using Move, you can do batch migrations. So if you're on Hyper-V or vCenter, on VMware, you can do batch migrations up to 25 at a time. And the guest OS, if you want to do the automated migrations, make sure USC is disabled, WinRM is enabled, and antivirus, you might want to turn that off because that can prevent the install of our VirtIO drivers, which are our virtual machine tools. If for some reason you can't do these things, Move will give you a script to use, and you can do it manually through Move to still help you automate it, but it won't be fully automated because you have to use that script if you can't get past these three things. And then just make sure that your VM naming issues, that there's no non-English characters, single and double quotes aren't in the VM name. And then for pre-migrate, for ESXi, it has to be a vCenter source and then one AHV target at least. Hyper-V, direct from the host, direct from the cluster, so don't need VMM, over to the AHV target. If you're doing non-move, like the manual process for like Zinsor, for example, or P2V, just make sure you back up, do a backup and look at migration windows too, because especially on the VM, when you're doing that copy in Zinsor, you're going to have to power down that VM, do that copy. So make sure you have migration windows there. And then post-migrate, remove all tools, remove all ghost devices. So if you go in Device Manager and see ghost devices in there, make sure those get cleaned up. If you're on persistent desktops and you need NGT, which is our Nutanix guest tools, install that if you need that. Whether you're doing move or manual method, I've had this come across me a couple times with customers. Make sure you power on the VM after you move it. Don't just go ahead and say, okay, take a snapshot and deploy MCS from it, because that VM is coming from a different hypervisor, different hardware. It might need to rediscover some things. It might need to do a couple reboots, and you might have to repair the VDA. So make sure that you bring that up, make sure you test it, verify it, and then roll out your catalogs or add to a new catalog if it's persistent. And then if you're PVS, reinstall the target device agent on there and move that into a vDIS for PVS. That's migration. Go ahead, Mike.
Just real quick. So from a move perspective, all move targets have to be, the targets have to be AHV. I mean, you guys, right now, you don't have anything that's not an AHV target, right? Going from, say, AHV to AWS, everything has to be going to AHV, correct?
Correct. Today, that's all AHV targets. And, I'm sure that the move will be enhanced to do other things because we have other things, that we're looking at doing. But today it's AHV only.
Okay, no, that's cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So, Stephanie, is it okay if we go a few minutes over? This is my last section, but I know it's 5 minutes to the hour, so I just want to check.
Yeah, I figured you were going to ask that.
Okay.
So yeah, I was going to say, let's just make a quick announcement that we might go a little bit over, and that's fine.
Okay. So disaster recovery. So this is a big topic, and how we do DR on Nutanix. So before we get into DR, it's what are your requirements first for DR? What needs protection? Do you need everyone protected, or do you need certain business critical use cases protected? And those workloads. Look at your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective, so your SLAs. Try to keep it simple as possible, and then look at what your complexity and cost are going to be. And that's where it comes into where it's okay, do we need to have a secondary data center we manage, or do we need to use some kind of service that we can just manage the software and not manage the capital underneath the software? And then look at infrastructure protection, right? So your VM, so look at SQL, your delivery controllers, PVS, all those different things for infrastructure. How are we going to manage those? Look at file services, your persona storage, home drives, profiles, redirected folders. And then if you're using app layering, look at the elastic layers, which are easy because those are read-only, so we can copy those anytime. But user layers, since there's a read-write, those can't just be copied from A to B. You have to look at, how you can do that because they're open, they're mounted, they're in read-write mode. So look at, storage replication, look at third-party tools, look at a maintenance window to copy those, and so forth. One tool I've been testing, and we've had a couple of customer POCs on this, is that peer software can actually replicate replicate the actual user layer, and then only do the delta replication of the changes instead of having to take out maintenance windows and so forth. So that seems like a viable option, and that's more testing I'm doing and a couple POCs we have going for that. And then look at your workload protection, right? Replicate your image templates, your master image, and if you're using persistent VMs, make sure you replicate those and make sure those are protected for those use cases that are business critical. So on Nutanix, how do we do that? In 5.10, we introduced a feature called Leap in DR orchestration. And so what it does is that if you have it in your data centers, so you have data center A, data center B, you have your Prism Central paired on each side, and we can do things like protection policies, recovery plans, and do test failover and actual full failover too as well. Your availability zone will be basically a data center or a Xi region, and I'll discuss it the Xi leap in here in a little bit too as well. The protection rules basically define how you wanted to protect your actual things. So the RPO, the RTO, the retention, and the recovery plans are going to be things like your boot order, right? So if I'm doing a full DR failover of Citrix, I want to have things booted up in a certain order and wait for certain things to be up, like my SQL, my controllers, then my VDAs, and not just spray and pray and have to reboot things once everything is up and not connected to each other. Things like network and IP address, getting failed over, and then look at script execution as well. That's hopefully that's coming soon. And then look at, again, we can do failover. So we can do an isolated failover. So if you want to do a test failover, we can do it to an isolated network. And then for a full failover, it's just one click, and you can do basically a full failover and bring things up in that certain order to test things if you want to do like a full DR testing plan. So that's a DR orchestration and leap that we introduced in 5.10. Now, we also have Xi Leap. And what Xi Leap is basically our cloud-based DR as a service. So basically what you have is your cluster for Nutanix on-prem, and then you have our Xi Cloud, whether that's our Xi Cloud, Xi AWS, I'll talk about that too as well. And basically you have a site-to-site VPN connection, and you replicate over to the Xi Cloud. Now, our Xi Cloud stuff is only an AHV target, but we have some cross hypervisor stuff that we can do, and we support, of course, AHV to AHV. The nice thing is that the interface is the same look and feel in Prism as it would be as if you were on your own cluster on-prem. It's just a more locked down interface where you don't have access to everything. Again, the nice thing is that you pair the Prism Central instances. It's all one click. You go through and create your protection policy, you do your recovery plan, and then you have that as well. And then you can do subscription plans also. So if you're looking for a pure DR option, you can have DR as a service instead of having to manage a secondary data center or a secondary capital. You're just managing software into a secondary cloud location. And then so look at those DR components. So looking at the site provisioning, replication, automation, the policies, network connectivity, and that's all done in our Xi Leap service as well. So as part of our Nutanix Cloud services, we have our Xi Leap. Again, that's going to be our Xi Leap Cloud or in Xi clusters that we announced at .next recently. And then from a Citrix standpoint, I've been testing this. And so from a Citrix standpoint, for a service, we have our on-prem instance of our Nutanix cluster. We have our Xi Cloud instance, and with our recovery plans, we can do the failover of the master images, the persistent desktops. We can do PVS in our Xi Cloud because it's the same AHV that we have on-prem is in our cloud. So we have all that functionality that we have on-prem, and then we can replicate that over, do our DR testing, bring things up in a certain order, and support all that too. And then from an external access standpoint, which I didn't put on here, is that we also support NetScaler VPX as well. So if you do have a full DR failover, you can have remote access coming through Citrix Gateway VPX, the new naming, have that in the cloud as well. That way you have remote access and do things like GSLB from on-prem to our cloud and so forth. So that's what I've been testing with a couple of customer POCs going, but that's what I've been testing in our Xi Cloud services for Nutanix. Another thing here too is that, so this is an example of what a DR orchestration looks like. So in here, this is my protection policy. And so I named it Citrix. I have a location, which is my local Nutanix cluster, my recovery location, which is going to be our Xi Cloud services somewhere. I can set up my RPO, I can set up my retention policies, and then I have categories, right? So I have my controller or my infrastructure layer, which is like my controllers, PVS, and so forth. For this test, I had SQL installed locally instead of putting a separate tier for SQL. So I have SQL Express on the actual PVS and the controllers. Then my VDAs, and then a client I was using for internal testing to mimic an internal client testing. I have those categories, and what those categories do is that once I have my protection policy set up, I go through and create a recovery plan. So in my recovery plan, I go through and name it, give it a description, and those categories that I showed you in my protection policy that are part of that protection policy for replication, for the retention of the recovery of that, I then have my categories for startup, right? So you see my first one is my infrastructure layer is getting started, and my test client is getting started. I can put a delay in there to give it time to make sure that the services are started up. And then once that's done, it waits and then it brings my VDAs up. So if those were persistent desktops, my infrastructure will be up and waiting, ready to connect to the controllers and register with them and not have to reboot them in case I brought things up in the wrong order. And from a MCS or a PVS master image standpoint, I can bring those VMs up to, and then, there's some scripting stuff that we're looking at doing to be able to actually orchestrate the actual catalog creation or spin those VMs up in that DR instance. So that's an example of the power on sequence of recovery plan. And then network mapping, right? We have a test network we can do if we want to, but then we can also fail over our network. So, those IPs will remain, and using our Nutanix IPAM stuff, we can use that as well with this and retain, if they're DHCP addresses also, look at the same ones when they boot up on the other side. But then for external access is that we can assign an external IP to our Citrix gateway virtual server, and then also do our policy-based routing for our firewall rules to allow network into that as well for that. And so that's how our orchestration works, and that's what's there today in 5.10, and look for that to be enhanced as we go past 5.10 from a DR standpoint. I talked about Xi clusters. So Xi clusters, Xi cloud services, same interface, same look and feel, but we also announced recently our .next conference that we can do Xi clusters on AWS. So what happens is basically we have our cluster that's on our data center, and we can extend that over to, I'm getting click happy, over to AWS cloud to have Xi clusters on AWS on bare metal. Again, same look and feel, same flow I talked about before with Citrix, just a little bit locked down interface because we're not getting access to everything, but it's gonna run on bare metal inside of AWS. And what that looks like is basically we have a site-to-site VPN, we have our Xi clusters in EC2 on bare metal. We can pause them, we can resume them, things like that, and use that for DR purposes. So if we need a DR location, we can use Xi clusters on AWS for that. Other things too, our networking, again, we have our VPN from our on-prem to AWS cloud, we have our VPC, we have our Xi clusters on bare metal, and then we have all of our backend AWS services behind that too as well. Some difference here between that is the main thing is that you don't get hardware access. It's API-based provisioning, and then you pay your per node per subscription based. The i3 metal is the starting model. You can hibernate, resume, and then it's global availability across AWS regions. So if you want that same look and feel Nutanix on-prem in the cloud, you can use that. And one thing we're working on too is that since our Xi clusters and our Xi interface, that is all Prism Central Xi overlay based. And for Citrix, our plugins today are all Prism Element PE based. And so right now we're going through and fixing those and updating those to be fully integrated into our Xi cloud services and our Xi clusters. So if you're looking for a DR option as a service for Citrix, that's where this comes into play. And that way you don't have to manage another data center, the hardware, so forth. It's all software in the cloud basically, and that's how you can manage that. Additional resources. So I went through a lot pretty fast. We have some questions at the beginning. I can do a follow-up webinar just on DR alone and multi-site if you guys are interested. Just let CUGC know, and we can get that arranged. But if you go to these links in here, so we have a landing page for Citrix virtual apps and desktops, where you can get all kinds of info, the instant on for Citrix Cloud for the Cloud Connect stuff, the ESG report for Citrix on Nutanix, customer case studies like JetBlue and other ones that are running Citrix on Nutanix, white papers, our reference architectures, those are all there. You can download Community Edition, and what's nice about that, again, you can play the same plugins, use the same infrastructure components on that. It's just only for test and development type stuff. It's not for production, but gives you the same look and feel as it would as a production Nutanix cluster. And then looking at things like Nutanix Flows, I talked about that briefly. We do have a document out there on that. So if you're looking at using Nutanix Flow with Citrix, we have that out there. We have a landing page there for our Leap disaster recovery service, and also more information on our Xi clusters on AWS. So a lot of good stuff out there. Sorry if I'm a little fast, but I was trying to get through this in the hour. But thank you for sticking with me, and thank you for the questions. And with that, are there any additional questions?
We've got a few questions here, Jarian, that I'm sure we can take offline because some of them might need a little bit elaboration and more explanation. But the when you talked about the disaster recovery piece, this is a question that I have.
Yeah.
When you talked about that, and you talked about the DRaaS, the DR as a service, are you really, what focus do you have on that in terms of, are you targeting MSPs and CSPs for that, or are you looking at enterprise to provide their own DRaaS for maybe, you know, robos or other places where they might have the clusters?
Yes.
All of the above?
So Xi clusters is a general term, and so stay tuned for more on that. Right now we have a DR as a service, and we have the Xi clusters on AWS, but just stay tuned for more on that.
Okay, all right, that's fair.
Good question, Mal.
Yeah, I think that's about it, Stephanie, if we want to close out the webinar.
Sure, I just have one little last slide for you guys. I'm gonna throw up there really quickly. Okay. And then I have a couple links in the chat for you. So thank you, Jarian. That was a lot of information. I know all of you are going to need to listen to the recording again or watch the recording again. And you'll get that link tomorrow. You'll get it in an email from GoToWebinar. You'll also get, in the same email, you'll get a link to a survey, which I've also put in the chat for you, and a link to the forum thread. If you have more questions, you can put those in the forum, and I will get those to Jarian and see if we can get answers. And then finally, the other link that's in the chat for you is a link to upcoming CUGC events. So if you haven't joined your local CUGC group, I hope that you'll go out to mycugc.org and find your group and get plugged in. We have over 70 groups around the world, so there is most likely one near you. So get involved. We'd love to have you. And finally, if you did opt in at registration for a chance to win the $100 Amazon gift card, the winner will be selected at random offline, and we will announce that person on Twitter. So make sure you follow us on Twitter at mycugc. And other than that, I think that's all I have for you guys today. I just want to thank Mike and Jarian again. That was a lot of information, Jarian. That was really great.
Well, thanks for having me. I hope it helped. Watch the recording, and I have some questions about the deck. Let me double check on that, and then if so, I'll send it to you, Stephanie. You can send it out to the attendees.
Okay, and if and at the very least, we can get that resources slide, right?
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, thanks everyone. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and hope to see you at another CGC webinar or at a local meeting sometime soon. Bye.
Bye.
Was that coming across clearly?